Hello and welcome to Ashrit Parvangada's Tipping Points, a podcast where we explore world tipping points that brought us to where we are today. In our very first season of episodes, we'll be looking at events that led to Europe's awakening as a relevant actor on the world stage, from one perspective. It'll tie into the dawn of capitalism, because there's no separating Europe's awakening from that. And it's all going to start with one man's holiday plans. I'm being a bit facetious here, but where I want to start the story really does start with one man's luxury vacation, maybe the most impactful vacation in history. This season will have multiple episodes. Every episode is going to touch some juicy tipping points. The season is called Red Lands, Black Hands. And this is its setup episode. Here we go. As I mentioned before, this story of Europe's awakening is going to start with one man. His name is Mansa Musa. You've probably heard of him before, or at least seen references to him in pop culture. He's known as the richest man in history. If you type richest man in history on Google, he will probably pop up. He's inspired a lot of the 21st century pop culture of rich black people. For example, there was a character in Game of Thrones who was clearly inspired by the guy. His name was Zaro, I think, and he was the richest man in Karth. You'll see his character type in a lot of other media as well. Mansa means emperor in Arabic. He was a Muslim ruler in the West African kingdom of Mali, which is still a country today. There's a country called Mali in West Africa in pretty much the same location that his empire was in, though his empire was bigger. How was he so rich? Well, he had access to some of the most productive gold mines on Earth, which Mali has access to this day, 700 years later, by the way. Gold isn't everything in today's world because we have oil and data and an infinite list of things that people say is the new gold. You know, people say data is the new gold, data is the new oil, oil was the new gold. But in the world of Mansa Musa, medieval times, simpler times, gold was the only gold back then. If you Google Mansa Musa's net worth, the number comes up as something like $400 billion, making him the richest person who ever lived. Though it's difficult to compare medieval wealth with modern wealth. But let's just say that for the year 1300, Mansa Musa, or 1311 when he comes to power, Mansa Musa was one of the richest people on the planet by a large margin. How did Mansa Musa become king of one of the most gold-rich places in the world? That's an interesting story on its own, and I hope you're as excited as I am as to how someone gets that title. According to an Egyptian emir who heard it from Mansa Musa's mouth personally, it all started with Mansa Musa's predecessor, Abu Bakr II, who is himself a fascinating character. Listen to what Mansa Musa has to say about him. I quote, "We belong to a house which hands on the kingship by inheritance. The king who was my predecessor did not believe that it was impossible to discover the furthest limit of the Atlantic Ocean and wished vehemently to do so. So he equipped 200 ships filled with men and the same number equipped with gold, water, and provisions, enough to last them for years, and said to the man deputed to lead them, "Do not return until you reach the end of it, or your provisions and water give out." They departed, and a long time passed before anyone came back. Then one ship returned, and we asked the captain what news they brought. End quote. So, before we continue the quote, this king, his predecessor, Abu Bakr II, sent 200 ships into the Atlantic Ocean to look for land to the west of Africa, or in other words, what would be the Americas. Of course, nobody in Africa or Europe knew about America at the time, but it is interesting that even a West African king tried to commission the journey in roughly the year 1311. This was one of the earliest attempted journeys of its kind. There was a trip made by the Genoans, who were a merchant republic in the northwest of Italy, 2 decades before this, which, as far as I can tell, was the earliest trip made with the intention of going to the West Atlantic. The ship of explorers and merchants sent by the Genoans in 1291 got lost. They were never heard from again. As far as I can tell, Abu Bakr II's trip of 200 ships was the second trip of its kind ever, and I think that's pretty noteworthy. And I'm deliberately omitting the Viking expedition in, I think it was 1021, because that wasn't a state-sponsored exploration that was well-funded with hundreds or thousands of people going. It was more just like people wandered over to the Americas, either accidentally or individually or in a small group of people, which has, while still impressive, has a different quality about it. Returning to Abu Bakr II's expedition, so of the 200 ships that he sends out full of food and gold and people, they wait for a while, presumably weeks, and one day, one ship returns. Can you imagine what the feeling is? You're sitting on shore and go, "It's them!" Or just one of them? Are they coming to tell us of the land they discovered and saying, "Bring more people"? We all went over there, bring more people, it's awesome. Though as the ship approached and people could see the faces of the crew, I imagine that the mood would have been more sullen. Continuing Mansa Musa's self-introduction, the king, Abu Bakr II, asks the captain what happened, and the captain says, quote, "We traveled for a long time until there appeared in the open sea, as it were, a river with a powerful current. Mine was the last of the ships. The other ships went on ahead, but when they reached that place, they did not return, and no more was seen of them, and we do not know what became of them. As for me, I went about at once and did not enter that river." End quote. Can you empathize being the captain walking up to the royal palace or whatever, knowing what you're about to say? In my job, sometimes I have a hard time delivering bad news, and the stakes are so much lower. Imagine being the guy who has to go and say, "Hate to be the bearer of bad news, all your 200 ships full of gold and food and people disappeared, and I ran away. I have no idea what happened to them." To add, that captain probably had friends or family on those other boats. Hell, half the city probably knew people on that voyage, if they weren't directly related to them. They'll never hear from those people again. What probably happened is that they got swept into the Canary Current, which is a strong current that goes from West Africa to the Americas. We have no evidence of whether they made it or not. So maybe there's 199 ships laden with gold and skeletons stuck at the bottom of a trench somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. Who knows, maybe someone will find it one day and get very rich. The last part of Mansa Musa's origin story is even crazier. So the king, Abu Bakr II, hears the captain's story and reacts, I quote, "But the Sultan disbelieved him. Then that Sultan got ready 2,000 ships, 1,000 for himself and the men whom he took with him, and 1,000 for water and provisions. He left me to deputize for him and embarked on the Atlantic Ocean with his men. That was the last we saw of him and all those who were with him. And so I became king in my own right." End quote. The Sultan didn't believe the captain. From a supposed failed expedition of 200, he puts together 2,000 ships and departs himself. You have to be a particular type of person to do that, right? If someone tells me that thousands of people tried a journey and all of them disappeared except for one ship, I would avoid making that journey. I'd be like, no, I'm going to stay at home and watch Netflix or whatever they did back in medieval times for fun, right? So this guy, Abu Bakr II, who is maybe suspicious as to where his ships full of gold ended up, or maybe just an adventurer, decides to make the journey himself and puts Mansa Musa on the throne as deputy, and they never see the other guy again. So Musa is now king. I want to clarify that historians don't really know exactly what happened here. Could it be that Mansa Musa usurped the throne and said that his predecessor sailed into the ocean? That's convenient. He just left and you'll never see him again, and now I'm king. Don't ask any questions. But he's really buried in the backyard. It wouldn't be unheard of for monarchs. But since we can't verify either way, I like to believe that some version of Musa's story is true. So now Mansa Musa is king in the year 1311, and let's paint a picture of the world he's coming into, especially the regions peripheral to his world, which are places that he would have known about, because that context helps us put in perspective what's about to happen in his life. First of all, Mansa means emperor in Arabic. Mansa Musa himself is a Muslim king. A lot of African kings would convert to Islam to get support from the Muslim world, which surrounds Africa, right? North Africa is Muslim, what is today Morocco and Egypt and Libya. The Middle East is Muslim, still is today. And in this era, the northern parts of India are ruled by Muslims. I believe the Delhi Sultanate is in power. So everything that sub-Saharan Africa interacts with is Muslim. Generally in the world of 1311, the Muslims hold a certain amount of prestige across the world, which they don't anymore. The Middle East is a bridge between the rich, productive parts of the world, India and China, and the consumers of the world, Europe and Africa. Everyone wanted Indian and Chinese goods, and if you want to access them, you'll have to have good relations with the Middle East. This intermediary role is a large reason for the power of the Middle East in general, historically. A lot of it has to do with geography. Even though the Muslim world as a whole is in decline in the year 1311, over the last 100 years the Mongols came through and ravaged pretty much the entirety of it. The Middle East used to be a hub of science and technology. It was called the Islamic Golden Age, if I'm not mistaken. And after the Mongols, they weren't. And they haven't recovered since. They've just come out of the last crusade, which was the final iteration of a multi-century war against Christianity. In 1289, just a few decades before Mansa Musa's time, the Mamluk sultans of Egypt, which is one of the geographically important parts of the Muslim world, would conquer a crusader state in North Africa called Tripoli, which would mark the final phase of this existential war. And Europe itself is kind of fractured and still has this obsession with crusades, and they aren't doing too well as a whole either. But I'm not sure how aware Mansa Musa is of Europe, so we won't focus too much on Europe just yet. So that's the world Mansa Musa is in, and he wants to be famous in it. He wants to make a name for himself as one of the great Muslim sultans of the world. So in 1324, he sets off on a pilgrimage to Mecca via Cairo, Egypt. If the Mamluk Sultan in Egypt could win the last great war with the Christians at Tripoli, then maybe that's the party that you want to be seen at. As far as he's concerned, the Muslim sultans are the who's who of the world. He wants preferential trade access. And he's going to go to Egypt and then Mecca to join the club of international Islamic celebrities. It's a bit like going to Hollywood hoping to party with the A-listers, right? You want to party with Brad Pitt or whoever it is at the moment. If you're just about anybody, well, tough luck. But if you're the richest person on earth, you have a pretty good shot. So Mansa Musa takes his money with him, a lot of it, 80 camels, each carrying more than 100 kilos of gold, 60,000 men, each carrying 1 kilo of gold, slaves, you name it, all to get in with the cool kids. How does his journey go? Does he get in with the cool kids? Does he become an international Islamic celebrity? Join us on our next episode to find out. This is Ashrit Parvangada's Tipping Points. See you next time.